discussion. I am very excited and privileged to be in this space with experts who will talk to us about the BRT standard as we unveil the 2024 edition. It is indeed a year of the bus, as we coined it at ITDP, and the release of the BRT standard was just 2 days ago. I dropped the links before in the chat if you want to check out the publication and the infographics. We hope this webinar can shed more light on the BRT potential for cities as a scalable and replicable transport solution and open up interesting discussions around transport planning throughout the next several months. Today, we'll explore the enhanced metrics, emphasizing climate resilience and transport equity, while also delving into BRT opportunity in the Africa region. So let me introduce you to today's panel, first starting with Jacob Mason, Director of Research and Impact at ITDP Global. Jacob is a lead expert at the global team and also has been spearheading activities around the 2024 BRT Standard edition. He'll moderate the session and will also give a brief context on the BRT Standard. Then the three panelists will unpack the evolution of BRT as a sustainable transport solution and the inclusion of resiliency measures, and what they mean for today's cities. So first panelist, Ricardo Giesen, is the director of the BRT Plus Center of Excellence based in Chile and the BRT Standard Technical Committee member. He'll talk about the fundamental features of BRT and how they have changed cities where BRT systems have been implemented. Welcome, Ricardo. The next speaker will be Maria Fernandez Ramirez, who is the sustainability lead at Despacio and also member of the technical committee. She will talk about the equity issues and how the transport system should be planned for the users, underscoring the new metrics of the BRT standard. Hello, Mafe. And finally, we'll hear from Claire Birungi, Transport Systems Manager at ITDP Africa, about the BRT progress in the Africa region, pointing to both opportunities the BRT has and challenges that cities should also be prepared to mitigate. So again, I'm very excited to be in this space. I just really want to give a big round of applause for all this hard work the technical committee has been doing to work on this amazing tool. And Jacob Mason, my colleague from the global team, will talk to you more about this publication. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ivona, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm here to talk about the 2024 edition of the BRT Standard, which is focusing on context, quality, and resilience. So just an overview. We only have an hour, so we're not going to get into all of the technical details of the new standard, but we're going to provide some information to get you interested and kind of show briefly what's changed and what's new. And I'm going to start this presentation with some context to set the stage for the panelists who can give more details. So I just want to first start with BRT and how it relates to public transport. BRT is a very high quality service that can really move a lot of people and provide all of the elements that we're starting to think of for high quality public transport, being connective, convenient, consistent, comfortable, affordable, customer friendly, and clean for a really high functioning public transport system. And BRT can be the epitome of that. And moving lots of people in a small amount of space quickly is incredibly important in big cities for people to be able to access large parts of those cities. So BRT is a really important tool in the public transport toolbox. It's not the only tool, of course, but a really important one. So how did we get here? We developed the BRT standard in response to a real lack of clarity on what was and what wasn't BRT. And so people could use BRT as a tool to improve public transport and know what it meant to talk about BRT. So we first developed this in 2012, and we've updated it a few times. The last update was 2016, and we're really excited to have this 2024 edition released now. So the process for updating the standard, we had 14 BRT experts from around the world. And even though not everyone lived in all of the different places, the people on the technical committee had really worked in all sorts of different environments around the world, working closely with local experts and governments, and bringing that to the table for discussions on updating the standards. We held weekly meetings for a few years back during the COVID pandemic, when everyone was locked in their house, in their homes. We decided to meet up weekly and really share the experiences and get this moving while people had a little bit more time, or many of the technical committee members had more time to talk about the issues and the opportunities for improving the standard. We also incorporated user feedback from previous versions of the standard. People shared their experience using the standard and what could be improved, what challenges there were, really from projects around the world. And we reviewed, as a technical committee, each element in detail. Personally, I'm not a member of the technical committee, but the technical committee members really donated amazing amounts of time to this because they really care about creating public transport that works for people and provides the elements of good service that I talked about above. So just very briefly, I'll talk about some of the elements of the BRT standard update. This edition really has much more emphasis on context, which recalibrates the BRT basics and some of the scores to reflect the diverse types of systems that exist. Some BRTs can run in incredibly high demand contexts and move very, very high amounts of people, akin to metro systems, but some can move a lot of people without necessarily needing to move as much as a metro. So we really updated the scoring to reward the systems that were well designed, even if they didn't move metro levels of people. We focus more on quality, adding indicators and metrics for gender, safety, and improving the indicators on access. We also added more emphasis on business operations, responding to some of the challenges we've seen in BRT operations in BRT corridors around the world, to make sure that the business models set the BRT operations up for success. And then we focused more on improving passenger and customer experience, so that as people design and think about improving BRT corridors, they can incorporate these elements into the designs. And lastly, we focused more on resilience, looking at measures to improve the greening around stations and in stations, to do things like collecting stormwater to avoid inundating sewers, improving the ability to adapt to things like power outages, so having backup power supplies at public transport stations, BRT stations. And then again, similar to that is emphasis on business operations that are financially sustainable. So with that, ITDP is excited. We're calling 2024 the year of the bus, building off this release of the BRT standard. Soon, we will be releasing it in 4 additional languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, and Bahasa Indonesia. Later in 2024, we will be working on some other bus-related projects, some tools for assessing the climate impacts of BRT systems. We're looking at assessing the financing and helping to improve financing of BRT and other public transport corridors, and then educational tools to share knowledge that we've gained through the experience working around the world on public transport and bus products and public transport networks. So with that, I'll stop, and I want to pass it over to our first speaker, I believe is Ricardo is going first.
Yes.
So I'll stop sharing and pass it over to Ricardo from the BRT Center of Excellence.
Thank you, Jacob. Let me share my screen now. I'm So I'm sharing now my screen and I should be in presenting mode. So let me start by saying and give you a brief overview of what BRT projects had been and where they were born. I think we started with the view of Jaime Lerner in Curitiba, who started with the project, and he was a visionary in the sense that he wanted to build great transit corridors, and he wanted to do it with buses, and he thought about doing it and thinking outside of the bus, because the main problems of bus corridors are mainly that you get stuck in traffic, and the time you spend in bus stops is very high for a passenger that travels a long trip. So solving these two problems with infrastructure, and on top of that, as an architect, he introduced the idea of these high density corridors in which you have a lot of trips, so that you can combine and have bigger vehicles to share to solve those requirements. So BRT systems then combine infrastructure, equipments, and operation. And infrastructure, we mean the segregated busways, station with prepayment and boarding levels and alignment in all doors, which increases the speed at which people get in and out of the buses and allows buses to stop for a short time. And to have a high frequency corridors, we needed equipment, a lot of buses running in this corridor, so that we reduce the waiting time of passengers. And we have good buses that improve the quality of services and improve the standard of the corridors. And then the terms of operations are very relevant here, because to have short dwell times, you need to have good information for passenger, high frequency services, and an average speed that at the end is very similar to what metro systems can provide. And on top of that, with the experience of traveling on the surface, looking at the city. So when we compare the alternative modes to give transit corridors, we end up with the BRT as in terms of capital cost, lower, and with a high capacity. And in many cases, the capacity can reach up to 40,000 passengers per direction per hour. In the case of Bogota, they reach even higher number of passengers per direction per hour. But then, of course, when you increase too much the number of passengers per direction per hour, you decrease the quality of service, because then you have a lot of crowdedness on the buses. So BRT can be an affordable, practical solution to offer high quality and high capacity of public transport systems. However, these are tricky systems to implement in cities, because you have many options, they have many details, and you're working in the surface of the city, so you need to interact very well with other transportation modes. So do it correctly, it's a tricky thing, and it's not only technical, but it's a very complex project. Therefore, we had been studying at the BRT Center of Excellence since 2010 BRT projects, not as an advocate of BRT as a transportation mode, but to understand in which context these are the right solution, and what are the features of a BRT project that will benefit the most a particular city. One of the key moments on BRT project was the implementation of Transmilenio, and Transmilenio probably focused a little bit too much on moving a lot of people per corridor, and I think at some point in Spanish, they were called Transmilleno, because they were carrying so many people, so crowded, that the level of service was deteriorated. And I think in that regard, it's very relevant to have the opportunity here to share this standard guide that provides a place where you can look at the different options that BRT have, and allowed to reflect on how to improve the level of service for passengers. And I think this is very relevant when we discuss this issue. Another fundamental piece in the development of BRT projects was the development of BRT projects in China. Here we are seeing a picture of Guangzhou, who was the winner of the Sustainable Transport Award in 2011. And this is a new way of looking at projects, and they were very well connected. But if you look at the evolution and the number of BRT projects that have been implemented around the world, we peak at the end of 2014, and then we had been decreasing the number of projects. And I think it's very important at this point in time to reflect what makes a good implementation and what type of cities will be benefited and what type of corridors will benefit the most by BRT projects. So here I'm showing some new developments in terms of the type of vehicles that are being used in some cities. And I think at some point, when we started studying BRT system more than 10 years ago, there was a big discussion if you should have a BRT project in one corridor or a tram corridor in one corridor. And today the technologies have been kind of merging because the buses are now electric, the type of buses and the type of operations are very similar to a tram. So the topics that should be addressed are very in line with this new standard, in which you need to incorporate the topic of quality of service, resilience, type of users. And I think that's a very interesting part of the discussion that we're going to have. So I think one of the main conclusions after 10 years working on BRT systems is that BRT, the bus rapid transit system, cannot be delivered with the same rationality than in the past, in which it were only to move people. We need, what are the attributes that make a good BRT system? What are the relevant in different contexts? And I think this type of guide help us a lot in discussing that. And I think the talk by Mafe Maria Fernanda Ramirez, who's following me, will shed some light on this. Thanks. Go ahead, and I think I need to stop sharing so that you can go ahead.
Okay.
Mafe.
Gracias, Ricardo. Thank you, everyone in ITDP, for including this espacio as part of the technical committee. Well, what I'm going to talk about is exactly, well, following Ricardo, is what's new about the BRT standard regarding equity and gender. And it's something that I wanted to call, just give me a minute so I can share my screen. Can you see it? Perfect. It's how do you include inclusion in the BRT standard? And that's something that we need to understand. I mean, it's one of the most important things is we need to understand how women move, because mostly since women are the main, if not the main, but most women are the caregivers, the ones who take care of the family, who take to make trips of care. Well, we have different types of mobility. So here's the story. Women do these trips of care who are doing grocery shopping, taking friends and family to the doctor, walking with them, just doing small things that make life better in a family. So what happens is that all these trips of care are, well, first of all, women don't have the same income as men, so they have a different type of, they need different types of resources to move. So what we found out is that women are 66% of transit users worldwide. So we need to think about them when we plan these systems. And we found this has happened in Bogota and in several countries around, in cities and countries around the world, is that public transit is the second choice of mode of transportation for women. The walking is the first one, public transit is the second one. Yes, some women have cars, some women move by motorcycles, but the second one is public transportation. So you need to understand how women move so we can help them move better. So here's the story. These trips of care are different than the ones that are normally used for transportation planning, to plan for routes, to plan for highways, to plan for schedules, for everything. Why? Because the trips of care are, first of all, shorter. So you don't get out of your house and go to the office. You get out of your house, you go to the grocery store, you go to the supermarket, you go to the drugstore, you go to the doctor, you go to your children's kindergarten. So that's a short trip. And then you take another short trip to your workplace, maybe. Um, and then you do another one, like very short trips. So what happens here is that these trips of care are not like what us transportation engineers used to know as pendular trips, that you go from home to the office, back home to the office, like every single day from Monday to Friday. Women are different. Women who move by care, they're not different. They're not pendular, they're polygonal. Like go from their home to the store, to their office, to the doctors. They're very short trips. So we still need to understand that this means these trips of care have very different peak hours. And if we want to start thinking about how to help women move, we have to start thinking about integrating systems. How do we move if we use the BRT, if we integrate it with another bus system, what if we do it if we integrate it with a bike share, if we integrate it with a pedestrian network? So we start thinking about how to help these women move easier. And also, these trips of care normally require the person, the woman, normally the caregiver, to carry or push someone or something. They're either carrying a baby or pushing a stroller, a grocery cart, whatever. So you have to think that you have someone that moves at different times that we used to know, that moves carrying things, that makes less money, that needs different, let's say, time windows to do a mode switch. So we need to start thinking about that. And the conclusion is here is that if you help women move easier, everybody's going to be able to move easily. So why not make it easier for everybody? Start thinking about how women move in in the city. So here's what's really cool about the new BRT standard, and it's something that, well, working in the Espacio, we think about always about gender and road safety, and this is what we find it's really cool. There are points. Well, normally there used to be points like bigger. There was a big category on universal access. If your BRT system has universal access, that you're thinking about ramps, you're thinking about communication, you're thinking about um, talking about the routes or the planning to people who are visually or hearing impaired, people who move differently, who you can see the lady here in Guadalajara has crutches. There's an older gentleman. So if you think about how these people move, those are trips of care. The woman in the crutches, she's taking care of herself. So if you start thinking about those trips, you start thinking about everybody else. So yay for scoring universal access. Also, we start thinking about in two different categories: green spaces, how to make it friendlier, and how to have safe environments. Especially, again, we go back to women. Women, we are harassed in public transportation the most. We are the largest group of users, and we are the ones who are harassed the most. So there are points for that as well. This is something new, and this is something that we must be proud of, because we are thinking about safety, not only road safety but personal safety, and how inviting the system is. This is a beautiful picture from Medellin, which, like every station, I think, Iwana, you were there last year, every stop at the BRT system is like a garden. So it's beautiful. It's inviting users to be there. Again, universal access, again, points for mode integration. So you're communicating how your routes are, or the emergencies or the changes in routes, to people who communicate or move in different ways. So this is something really cool about the BRT standard. This is something that we need to be aware when we're talking about accessibility, equity, and integration. How do pedestrians get to the station? But how do pedestrians? You can see this woman in Pune. She is moving. She's carrying something in one hand, in one arm, and the other one she has a baby. I mean, she has a toddler. So how do we help her to move around the station and between the bus and the platform easily. So that's something that's going to give or take points from the standard. So this is good. This is again, this is equity and trips of mobility. Also, again, this is something that it was included on previous editions, but this is something new. We're thinking about the scheduling of the BRT. Of course, there's always points for having a more availability of the BRT system, but let's start thinking. This is something that the BRT is calling the planning profiles. So how do you understand what different types of people move? So you see, how are your routes and your schedules planned? Because you're thinking of different types of people. And I'm sorry, second to last, and I know you wanna. I'm almost done. And the last one is, how do you integrate the system? I mean, we talk about integrating with with other buses, with the pedestrian network, but let's think about bikes. They're the cleanest, the coolest, the easiest to move around. So this BRT standard is giving more points to BRT systems who are integrated with bicycles in any way. So there are three different types of scoring. Is if you have bicycle infrastructure, you can see the road in Mexico. If you have access to a bike share system like the one in Mexico, or if you have a parking space in close to the station or inside the station. This is a picture from Bogota. So yeah, this is like another kudos to the BRT system, because it's thinking about integration in moving people easier, quicker, but safer. And this is it. Thank you, Ana. And now, Claire.
Thanks, May, for that brief. Let me quickly share my screen. Give me a minute. Okay, Ivona, tell me if you see my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. As I was introduced before, my name is Claire Birungi. I'm the Transport Systems Manager for ITDP Africa. So with my short presentation, I'll just give it a few key features of the updated BRT standard, pointing particularly why this is important for African cities. So we know that most of the African cities are skyrocketing populations. They're growing super fast. So this BRT standard is basically implementing the BRT standard is going to give a potential to provide equitable transport services. And as Maeve had mentioned, with a biased focus or expanded focus on inclusion of women, children, and their caregivers, and everyone else using the public transport system. But first, to give an overview for the African context, not to say that this is how it all looks like, but these are some of the issues. You'll see on the top right, that is in Kampala, and on the bottom left, that is in Addis Ababa. So these issues are cross-cutting. Most of the issues you can see congestion, lack of services. You can see the queues, people waiting for public transport services, especially during the peak hours. The vehicles are usually the minibus or microbuses, 14-seater vehicles, which are old and polluting. So basically, using this updated BRT standard is basically going to equip planners, engineers to design a more equitable system in order to address the challenges that I've shown just above them. So some of the most important features of the BRT standard is a new focus on industry transition, business model improvements, scoring based on improved service planning methods, best practice infrastructure, which is also important, integration access, and also vehicle and rolling stock fleet. So I'll just go quickly into each one of them just a little briefly, just to touch on what should be the focus of it. One of the most important points for the African context is basically to consider the industry transition that I mentioned above. This is one of the fundamental principles, and is that one of the fundamental principles is that we need to have action basically from both the private sector and also from government if we are able to provide quality bus services. So in order to form modern bus companies, we need action. To 1 minute. I don't know if my slide is going right. Yes. To form modern bus companies, we need action both from the private sector. We need the existing services to consolidate and form modern bus companies. But we also need to make sure that we have action from government to be able to regulate these services in order to provide quality services. The BRT standard also encourages basically the adoption of sustainable funding models. As I'd shown in the pictures previously, most of our systems are operating under the net cost contracts, where the existing operators collect their fares and pay a license fee to maybe to the transport authority. But we need to move towards the sustainable gross cost contract models, where fares are collected into a trust fund, and these are paid out to the different bus operators. And where there is a gap in funding the transport systems, then we have a clear channel in which basically government can inject sort of like a subsidy into the trust fund, which can be shared equitably amongst the operators, the fare collection operator, and the trust fund managers. There is also definitely an increased focus on improved business models. We can see that with the new updated BRT standard, the BRT design basically recommends improved, basically the operators can be, just trying to find the right word for that. The operators can be awarded basically based on performance. So because most of these systems will be operated on per kilometer and not on the target system as before, so they can operate their daily range that they meant to cover for that day, and if they cover it, then they can be awarded. And also, if the services are not good, the vehicles are dirty, there can be penalties that can be imposed, which are necessary to make sure that we maintain a good quality service. And also, this is an image from the recently launched Dakar eBRT system. So with such improved business models, we can see adherence to labor and gender standards, where workers can be paid based on the local labor standards for the specific countries. We're also enhancing improved focus on service planning, the need to consolidate existing services and design services that extend beyond up to the destinations of people. So basically providing direct services. On the right, that is a service plan that we had completed in Kampala. You can see where the high demand are located. So there is a need to not just operate in the BRT corridors, but also provide systems that extend beyond the BRT corridor to people's actual destinations. And of course, the infrastructure is also very important. We need to make sure that the infrastructure that we design also gives advantage in terms of travel time savings, comfort, etc. And there's also improved focus on minimizing bus emissions, of course, with increased attention to climate and resilience. We have put in the standard basically to score the systems that adopt cleaner vehicles. This is one of the projects that we are doing in Kigali. This is one of the first pilot electric bus projects in Kigali in partnership with Solutions Plus. And also very important is that last mile access is as important as the public transport systems. We need to make sure that there is integration of walking and cycling infrastructure, that there is universal access so we can provide dignified access for people coming to access public transport. With that, this map basically shows the development of BRTs in Africa. So you can see that there is an enhanced potential in African cities so far. And this was from, I think, last year. So you can see there is about 7 operating BRT systems in 7 cities and so many other cities that are under planning and implementation or construction of the side of the BRT systems. For more information, of course, the BRT standard is now public, so reach out to make sure that you understand or go through the steps for scoring your BRT systems. But also more important, if you can go to the quick guide to bus sector modernization, it provides a detailed process on how to undertake public transport reform, most specifically for African cities. And you can also find that on our website for itdpafrica.com. That is it, I think, for now. Thanks. Back to Bona.
Thank you so much, Claire. So I'm just going to bring the panel for the discussion with Jacob Mason here, and I'll pass it back to Jacob.
Thanks, Ivona, and thank you, Ricardo, Mafe, and Claire. Really interesting presentations. So I wanted to open up with a few questions, and I'll try to bring in questions from the audience as well. I'm going to start with you, Mafe. You described some important new elements to the BRT standard, especially around improving BRT for women, for people with disabilities. Adding more elements, of course, makes it more complicated, the standard. And as Ricardo said, it's already pretty complicated. How do you see the BRT standard working to create this change that we're trying to see in improving access and transport for women?
Well, on one hand, it's gonna help planners to see what we're seeing as women, to like I was telling before, as transportation engineers, you don't get taught to think like a woman. You're thinking about planning, you're thinking about speed, you're thinking about peak hours, you're thinking about like the traditional way of mode of thinking. But when you see the standard and you see, okay, I have to see something different, I have to put myself in the shoes of someone else, sit myself on a wheelchair, that part of the standard is going to make planners and builders and evaluators on those chairs, on those shoes, carrying that stroller, to understand what's going on, because it's really hard when you, I mean, as a woman, for me, it's really hard. I don't have children, I'm not married, so I don't know exactly what it is to carry a stroller because I never do it. So it's helping someone who doesn't have that view see it in a different way. It's making you like think about that. So it's very simple. If it's in the standard, it's part of a checklist, you have to think about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I as people in the chat are saying, excellent answer, and really appreciate that. I'm going to move on to you, Claire. We talked a bit about the context and the need for better context within the standard, and that there are many challenges within the African context where you work. Can you talk a little bit about where BRT can be applied most effectively, and maybe if there are mistakes we might want to avoid or people might want to avoid when thinking about BRT?
Sorry, you said where BRT can be most applied?
Yeah, where are there conditions or locations that are best suited for BRT or ones that are not? And are there mistakes that through the process of working on BRT that other people can try to avoid?
I think the usual discussion is about road space. If the BRT systems can accommodate, the existing infrastructure can accommodate to the BRTs, especially in cities that have narrow roads. But I think we are seeing increased focus that there's no such a thing as where it can be applied or where it cannot be applied. If you need to provide the system in that specific location because the conditions are right, there is the demand, and also maybe it's like a downtown street. you can convert some streets to all BRT corridors, as an example, or in some streets you can have, there are also different ways to design around these systems. We've seen in many other cities where I think they want to include passing lanes, but then it has been difficult, but then you can consider other sort of like station design, like staggered stations. So you can tailor your system depending on the condition, and there is always a way on how to do it. So there is no such a thing as not, or you can include it here or you cannot include it there.
Great, that's really helpful. I'm going to pass it to you, Ricardo. We talked a little bit about the improved emphasis on better operations for BRT and better business models. And one of the questions has been around funding, especially around transportation and land use planning. And I'm wondering if there's a link between that, between transportation and land use and funding to create better operations and maybe more sustainable operations.
Yeah, and I think that's like a very complex part of the equation of having a good transportation systems, is because many cities have very separated the decision making of the housing, land use, and transportation is in a completely different area. And in many countries, like in mine, for instance, there's a Ministry of Housing and there's a Ministry of Transportation, and it's very hard for them to communicate, and many of the projects are not well aligned. So sometimes you build the hospitals far away from the people who are going to serve that hospital, or you put housing in areas that are far away from the places that people who are going to live there are going to work. So I think coordinating these things will do a better transportation system. And if you go to BRTs, it's also the same case. And I think, yeah, someone mentioned, I think Hugo, no, or someone was mentioning here in the questions, how could Franco was mentioning that in Curitiba they used very well the land value capture in the project, because they built high density corridors with a lot of people living around. And I think that's something very important. I think Hong Kong is a good example of a city in which the development and the transportation system have grown together. But it's very complex, and I think that's a more political system that goes a little bit farther away even than only the funding part. Unfortunately, I'm not solving the problem. I'm just characterizing the difficulties.
No, that's really helpful. And I think that the challenges will be different in different places for figuring out funding and what works in each place. So appreciate the feedback on some ideas for that. I want to move a little bit to how the BRT standard can be used in places where BRT might be a new concept. And maybe I'll open up to everyone. So some places we got a question where there might be limited experience to implementing BRT, where there's not really much guidance on how to do it effectively. How can planners, designers, advocates use the BRT standard in places where it's maybe new to them, the concept is new, and the idea of an international standard is new? Maybe you can talk about your own experience in doing so. Maybe I'll ask Claire, as I imagine in many of the places you're working, BRT hasn't been implemented before. How do you use the BRT standard when talking to governments?
I think when we're talking to governments, the angle that we use is basically to promote basically best standards. And in most cities where this has not been implemented, sometimes at least there may be at like the basic stage or maybe at design stage. So we've had engagements with government where we help them to score the designs at the design stage. basically so that they can see areas that they can improve in the designs, in operations, in the business models they're planning to implement. So that way it helps them to think about a better system or a better operation. So that's how we're engaging with the BRT standard at present in cities that haven't started out.
Thank you. Maybe Ricardo or Mafe, can you talk about how it's used in places where there is BRT already? And maybe the goal is to improve the BRT or to expand BRT. Maybe I'll start with Mafe. You unmuted first.
Okay. Well, first we need to understand what the BRT standard is, because from some of the questions, we see that some people say, okay, in my city, this is not happening. In my city, this is not. The standard is like a scoreboard. So whatever you see, it's going on, you give it points, and then in the end, you tally, and then you know if it's really good, if it's not as good, or just something to work with. So if we're thinking about, I'm thinking about three types of users for this standard. One, the planners. Two, the implementators, the operators. And third, advocacy groups or social groups. The planners have a checklist of what to think about, like we were talking about gender. The people who are operating the system will have the checklist of improving with time. And social groups, the advocacy groups, can have again a checklist of, okay, this is our baseline. Where can we get? What can we ask from the government, the people who are operating the system? And is it possible? Can we get money for this? Is this useful? So for me, well, what I think is like a checklist for different types of users on how they want to work on it. If they want to have a checklist for planning, for building, for operating, or just for advocating for better systems.
Great. Ricardo, do you have any additions to that?
Yes, I think the guide also provides an international list of things that you can add to a BRT project and that had proven to be a good solutions. In many cases, when you want to solve a problem and you want to look at different solutions, it's very expensive to go abroad and look at different interventions. And here it's a good summary of good interventions, and we give points for doing and for working better. And I think it's a very helpful summary list of attributes and characteristics that good BRT systems worldwide have. So I think that's a very good way of looking at your project and what can be easy interventions that you can use to improve the quality of service. Because in many cases you don't see it until you go abroad or someone tells you about, and here you have a good summary to look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that the community here is really helpful for spreading ideas and seeing what's worked in different places. Obviously, things don't transfer one-to-one, but we can have new ideas and bring them over. We got a couple of questions, I think one from Narayan, about how to construct BRT and dedicated corridors and limited rights of way. We got another question about elevated BRT. So maybe Claire, I can ask you about that with your experience in the African context about working in constrained rights of way for BRT. What have been some approaches that you've had? What's worked? Maybe what's not worked?
Thanks, Jacob. I think it's a matter of priority, really, and what the city sets out to prioritize. We've been in several discussions with different institutions about such, and we have seen a change in attitude, especially when we have exposed some of these authorities to cities that have done it differently in even more limited spaces. So I think it's a matter of understanding, changing attitude, and setting priority as what's important for the city. As I'd mentioned before, there is no such thing as super limited. Some cities we've seen in some photos in all BRT and NMT streets, or we can have vehicles on one side. It's just a matter of deciding this is the direction I think the city wants to take, and it's about the leadership basically of the transport authority basically in leading that decision. So I think there's always a way to work around it if they understand, if they prioritize basically either BRT or decide to prioritize NMT corridors. I think that is what should be the priority. It shouldn't be about the discussion about if we have 25 meters right of way or if we have 55. I think we need to move a bit away from that discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful to bring in the question of political priority. If it's a priority, you can find a way to make good transport work. Maybe another question for the group. In the process of updating this, was there anything really surprising or interesting that you learned from talking to the other BRT experts in their work around the world? Maybe I'll start with you, Mafe, and then pretty soon we're gonna move to final thoughts.
Well, the interesting thing was that all these conversations starting during the pandemic. So we were thinking about, one of the things that we were thinking was, is it possible to keep using a BRT during a pandemic when people don't want to be close to each other? I mean, that you need to make it super healthy, super safe to people, for people to be able to use it. So yeah, how crowded do you want the BRT to be safe? And of course, then we started talking about being healthy, being safe. Then you talk about safety, and you start talking about gender. And also, I remember once we're talking about the distance between stations, because there's one thing what you see on the map, what you see on Google Maps, this is one station and then the other. But is it really, I think there was a comment there that Bogota has really long pedestrian overpasses. If you want to go from one station to the other, is it really a straight line? No, you have to walk like 5 times that distance. So that became part of the standard, that walking distance, that walking connection between stations. So yeah, for me, those were the 3 things that we're talking about: being healthy, um, being safe, being a woman, being a person who moves differently. And if you move differently, how long is the walking distance between one station and the other?
Thank you. Yeah, the context and the perspective of the user of the system is so important for creating a system that works for people. Okay, we have a few more minutes. I think I'm gonna ask each person to maybe give some closing thoughts, things that you are thinking about as people come away from this discussion about BRT and what they can take to their practice, their advocacy, their government, their professional work going forward. So maybe I'll start with you, Ricardo, and then I'll move to Claire and Mafe.
Yes, thank you, and thank everybody who connected and put some questions. I was reading the questions that in the chat, and well, probably we didn't touch in many of the very, very, very good questions. And there was one related to the network structure on the transit system, and it's always tricky when you're doing a BRT standard to reflect on all the transit modes and all the transportation system of the city, because then you get diluted, and because you're trying to improve these corridors. But we did add in this version subtractions on point in terms of the network, or how well the BRT system connect to other transportation mode, and how easy it is to access by other transportation mode. Because in a city, there's always attention on having more transit routes with less frequency, or increase the frequency in one big corridor. And someone else asked, and I'm not an expert in Africa, but what are the challenges in many African cities to build BRT corridors? And in many developing countries, the main challenges is that you don't have big corridors to build the infrastructure, and you don't have the space, and sometimes you need to build that space to provide the infrastructure required to have good public transport systems. So I think that those are two pieces of reflection on my side.
Thank you, Ricardo. Claire, any parting thoughts for the audience?
I think for me, the key takeaway should be to use the BRT standard not only as an after evaluation tool. It's if the city initiates a BRT project, you need to start with understanding the principles, using basically the BRT standard, using it. And then once they do the design system, evaluate the designs. If you're going to take industry transition, evaluate the transition. So at each stage of the implementation of the project, integrate the learnings from the standard so that you can improve your system. That would be my main takeaway, not to use it as an after evaluation tool, but make sure you use it in an inclusive way throughout the process.
Thank you. Yes, important point. This is very important to use as projects are being planned and thought out. Mafe, final thoughts?
I'm gonna say it again. It's really cool to have a gender perspective put into numbers.
Great, thank you. Very concise. So as Ricardo mentioned, and as you can see, there are many more questions than we had time to answer. This is the part of a conversation. We're looking to have learning hubs to dig into these questions more deeply, and help create better transportation planning that's more inclusive, that's more equitable, that's more effective, that works for more people and better cities. So we look forward to talking with you and to staying in touch. The links to the BRT standard, I believe, are in the chats. And I think Ivona can talk a little bit more to that. But thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Great, thank you so much. I'm glad that we had this quality time. We had ample amount of time for the Q&A. Of course, we'll have more webinars to dive deeper into some of these, maybe a little bit more technical topics or cross-cutting issues. So please stay tuned, be on the lookout for the Year of the Bus messages on our social media. I think that there'll be an easy way to follow development of different next steps with the BRT standard. Of course, I thank Jacob, you for moderating, Ricardo, Maria Fernanda, and Claire for joining us, really dedicating your time, also working on the BRT standard. So we do appreciate this, and the rest of the BRT standard committee who may be joined in the audience today. Also, I wanted to plug in the upcoming webinar that we have on our Boston work with the BRT and some of the initiatives that ITDP has been working on with partners there in the Boston region. So feel free to tune in on April 10th. The link was in the chat. And again, we are taking a note of all the things that people are asking here, different issues they're interested in. So please stay tuned for the next events on BRT Standard. And with that, thank you so much. I'm going to conclude this webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.